Bill, can you? All right, let's get started. So welcome to our effective communication training for state and municipal ADA coordinators. I'm Lilia Malikshi. I'm the communications and training manager at the Massachusetts Office on Disability, or MOD. So we just went through some housekeeping. All that information is going to be put in the chat as well if you came a little bit late. So I'll skip that. And I'll hand it over to my colleague Camille to get us started.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Camille Karapayich. I'm Council 1 for the Massachusetts Office on Disability. For anyone we haven't had the pleasure of working with yet, we are a small state agency that provides information, guidance, and training on disability-related civil rights and architectural access. Our goal is to help any member of the public understand their rights and obligations under disability rights laws and how they apply to different situations so that individuals can better assert their rights and comply with the law. MOD is not an enforcement agency, and we don't provide financial assistance, direct services, or vendor lists, but we do think we can be very helpful to you in other ways. So you can always feel free to contact us with questions about your rights. Next slide, please. So our presentation today is going to be a brief overview of the effective communication obligations. Our webpage does go into greater detail, and that's linked on our resources slide later on so that you can gather that information later. But for today, we're going to talk about what the effective communication legal obligations are, how to respond to effective communication requests, what the difference is between effective communication and reasonable accommodations, and when to request CART and ASL, as well as some best practices to achieve effective communication. And then I'll pass it on to my colleague Rob, who will cover disability accessibility requirements, resources, and reminders. Next slide, please. So Title II of the ADA is where the obligations for effective communication come from. Title II is the section of the ADA that applies to state and local governments, and it requires that state and local governments communicate effectively with members of the public who have communication disabilities. The law and guidance, at least at this point in time, define communication disabilities for the purposes of effective communication as only vision, hearing, and speech disabilities. There are certainly other disabilities that can impact communication, for instance, cognitive disabilities, but those disabilities are accommodated through the reasonable modification process instead. The law defines effective communication as the exchange of information, which can be oral, written, or otherwise, in a way that's clear to all parties involved in the interaction. This is one of those legal obligations that sounds really simple and clear, but we know sometimes can seem a little bit more difficult to implement or to understand exactly what it means when you're implementing it. So we'll do our best to clarify some of the common questions that people have about effective communication throughout this presentation. Finally, I wanted to mention that effective communication is a separate and distinct obligation from the obligation to provide reasonable modifications, which you all are probably very familiar with. You can kind of think of effective communication as being similar to the ADA's requirements for service animals, in that both are similar to asking for a modification or accommodation, but each has carved out sort of a special treatment for a specific scenario. So for instance, with service animals, if they were treated the same as reasonable modifications, you would be able to ask for a letter of support from a medical provider if needed, if it wasn't obvious. And you would be able to suggest alternative accommodations as long as they were also effective. But you all are probably familiar that neither of those things would be allowed for service animals because they have their own kind of special process where, as long as the individual who's the owner of the service animal can answer the two questions to show that it meets the definition of a service animal, then they're allowed into public places. So effective communication similarly has its own process, which we'll describe a little bit more in detail throughout this presentation. Next slide, please. So again, you all are likely pretty familiar with reasonable modifications. People often use the term accommodation, so I think it's written as accommodation throughout this presentation. They really are referring to the same thing. These are requests for a change to a policy, procedure, or physical structure to provide equal access to goods, services, or programs. And reasonable accommodations can certainly be related to communication, accessibility, but they are a little bit different from effective communication requests, which are generally requests that ask for an auxiliary aid or service that's required for there to be any communication at all. So kind of a little rule of thumb that you can follow is to utilize the effective communication approach in situations where individuals need an auxiliary aid or service in order to open basic communication with the entity. Next slide, please. So again, there are some similarities with reasonable accommodation requests, and that should hopefully help you feel comfortable in handling effective communication requests. So both of these requests are looking at both the disability-related need and the feasibility to provide whatever is being requested. So that means that they have that kind of reasonableness standard built into both of these processes. Similarly, or I guess that leads to the fact that they both share the denial reasons of undue financial or administrative burden, fundamental alteration, or there being no disability-related need for what's being requested. So again, that's kind of that reasonableness test that you are probably familiar with. Both of effective communication and reasonable accommodation requests should utilize a case-by-case analysis. So that means that you can't deny a request because you denied a similar request in the past. You can't have a blanket policy that you would never provide a specific request. You do have to look at those, again, individually as they come up. And of course, for both, just as good practice for anything, if someone, requests something, you should always provide a clear response as to, if you are providing it, if you're not providing it, why, and is there anything else that you can do that you can provide instead that might also be helpful. Finally, if either of these types of requests is handled improperly or the requester is unhappy with the results, they are able to follow the internal grievance procedure, which is considered informal, or to file a formal complaint with MCAD or DOJ. Next slide, please. So now some of the differences between the effective communication and reasonable accommodation request process. Effective communication requests are very frequently on-the-spot requests, such as the request to use pen and paper to communicate, to place an order. But they can certainly also be requests that are made in advance. Common one is requesting to have ASL interpretation at an upcoming meeting. Reasonable modification requests, on the flip side, are usually made in advance, but are occasionally on the spot as well. Reasonable accommodations have a requirement for an interactive process. So there might be a little bit more like communication or a little bit longer timeline for those than effective communication requests, which are supposed to be handled very promptly. Effective communication requests never require medical documentation. Reasonable accommodation requests sometimes require medical documentation in the setting of Title II state and local government. It would be a very unique situation to need medical documentation, but it is potentially possible in some situations. The most major difference to be aware of between effective communication and reasonable accommodation process is that effective communication requires Title II entities to provide the form of communication the requester prefers, unless that method is unreasonable to provide, and you can demonstrate that there's an alternative solution that is equally effective. With reasonable accommodations, instead, you are looking at alternatives that are effective for a broader range of reasons. So, for instance, you have something that you have an effective solution already on hand, it's easier to provide, it's cheaper to provide, something like that. You can use more reasons to look at effective alternatives if it's a reasonable accommodation request than an effective communication request. And finally, effective communication requests relate to auxiliary aids and services necessary for communication access. As we mentioned earlier, reasonable accommodation requests can be for communication access, but they encompass a much broader range of access, a much broader range of types of requests. And one little note at the end here, there is an additional denial reason possible for reasonable accommodations, which is direct threat, which would mean that providing what was requested would be unsafe. So that's just something to be aware of when you're going through the reasonable accommodation process. Next slide, please. So what communication is effective depends on three things: the nature of the individual's disability, the complexity, nature, and length of the interaction, right? So if somebody, for instance, is just going to pick up a form at an office, that's a pretty simple request. Whereas if somebody needs to, talk to a lawyer about a more complicated question, that's going to be something that is going to require a much deeper level of interaction. And so you're going to be looking at effective communication differently in those situations. And finally, as I mentioned on the last slide, Title II entities do need to give primary consideration to the individual's preferred method of communication. So that's going to be something you're considering when people are making requests as well. Next slide, please. So we've heard that staff often feel uncomfortable denying requests for effective communication, which definitely makes sense. I know we all want everyone to have access to all of our programs and services, but we thought it might be helpful to give two examples that highlight some ways that requests might be unreasonable. The first is probably the most common thing you're going to run into, which is a last-minute request. So if someone requests ASL interpretation at a meeting that's happening in an hour, that certainly just isn't going to be possible. So it would be reasonable in that situation to, explain that ASL interpreters have to be requested at least 2 weeks in advance. You can remind them of the request window that you publicized when publicizing the meeting. And you can and should certainly discuss if there's anything else you can provide that would make it possible either to access the meeting today or to access the information from the meeting, in a short time frame. Another example is for narrowing the request. So by this, we mean sometimes people ask for something broad when really what they need or what would be effective to meet what they're asking for is a narrower request than what they've said. So for example, if someone asked for every mass.gov page in Braille, you can, certainly understand why someone would ask for that. It might better provide the same access as somebody who's able to look through all the pages online. But it is probably reasonable to discuss what information they're really looking for exactly, and to get that information brailled so that they're able to address the current issue that they're having. Because certainly, you can talk about the website gets updated, very frequently from different places, all that kind of stuff, as to why it might not even be effective to have some of that information in advance if it might be changing. Next slide, please. So another common question we hear is when to book CART and ASL. CART is Communication Access Real-Time Captioning, and ASL is American Sign Language. The answer is truly as often as possible because effective communication and universal design benefit everyone. But we do understand that there are situations where it's not possible to get these types of services So the times when you should really be aware of booking them in advance are when you receive an effective communication or reasonable accommodation request. So the best practice to successfully meet these requests is to book your ASL and CART interpreters well in advance, and make sure it's clear to potential participants that these services will be available, and then set a date 2 weeks in advance of the meeting or presentation, which people would have to send a request by, and then you can cancel if there were no requests. However, if you know that this meeting or event has an audience that's known to include people who are deaf, or when the event is for a large indefinite audience, or when you're recording the training or event for the public, it's really helpful to have ASL and CART interpreters to ensure that anyone who comes across the material is going to be able to access that information that you're sharing. Next slide, please. So I know that Jonathan's going to go into much more detail and cover a lot more best practices later on, but a few from our end are to think about effective communication in advance. So this includes training your staff. You want staff to be able to know how to respond to requests for effective communication, as well as reasonable accommodations that are related to communication access. You want to make sure that that includes knowing how to respond to simple requests, knowing what equipment you have on hand, where it's stored, how to use it, who to call if it's not working, those sorts of things. And it also includes knowing, what requests are more complicated and need to be directed to the ADA coordinator, those types of things. One more thing to think about, making sure your staff are trained to know what a relay call sounds like, and know how to use those services in advance. Next, you want to have tools available. So that means, in many cases, acquiring tools in advance. So acquiring auxiliary aids, making sure if you have any kind of printed materials that you automatically print them in large print, making sure that your websites are accessible or compatible with screen readers, things like that. And on this point, we'll touch on it a little bit later, but remember that MOD does administer municipal ADA improvement grants, which can include funding for acquiring auxiliary aids and services. Be proactive rather than, one more. Be proactive rather than retrofitting your solutions. So Rob will probably touch on this later, but just like anything, it's much more helpful to build in accessibility from the start than to try to retrofit it later on. So it's going to save you time and energy and potentially money as well. So, really, again, trying to think about how you can build things in from the start, how you can build in universal accessibility. A couple other tips: proactively provide communication access at events as often as possible. Make sure you alert participants to the availability of communication, auxiliary aids, and services that you already have. So that includes in any kind of advertisements you put out on your websites, any kind of signage that might be posted around. And finally, provide clear instructions for how to make effective communication and reasonable accommodation requests. Next slide, please. So I'll pass it over to my colleague, Rob, to talk a little bit about digital accessibility.
All right. Thank you, Camille. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rob Dias. I'm MOD's Assistive Technology Information Specialist, and I'm just going to quickly talk about the new rules under the Americans with Disabilities Act that were finalized last year pertaining to digital accessibility. That obviously has a component here for effective communication. So this slide outlines the new requirements for digital accessibility set by the Department of Justice for state and local government. Under this new rule, public-facing websites and mobile apps are going to need to meet WCAG 2.1 Level AA for compliance. WCAG stands for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is a set of internationally recognized standards that explain how to make your digital content accessible to a wide range of the disabled population. I'm not going to go into those guidelines specifically because they're really robust, but basically they're made up of four core principles, guidelines, and success criteria. And the first principle is perceivable. So you need to make sure that your content is going to be perceivable to individuals that may have sensory issues. And some of those are making sure that any videos that you're posting include closed captions or transcripts, depending on the situation. If there's content that's going to be kind of visual in nature with no, spoken content, you need to make sure that that information is going to be accessible to individuals who may not be able to see the content. Like I said, there are a very robust set of standards. The compliance timeline is going to depend on the population size of the entity. So for jurisdictions that serve more than 50,000 people, the compliance timeline is going to be April 24th, 2026. And for jurisdictions with a population size under 50,000, you have a little bit more time. It's April 26th, 2027. So we have here a couple of exemptions, not all of them. Again, this is federally. A couple of things are going to be archived web content and pre-existing electronic documents such as presentations, word processing documents, and spreadsheets. And in order to be considered exempt, there's going to be some guidelines for that. So this is really focused on content that's already posted to your website or going to be posted prior to the compliance date. It's typically meant for things that are just going to be used for, research, record keeping, and reference. It's not meant for things that are going to be actively used from the public to either reply to or access or participate in a program. For a lot of these things, you're going to have a specific carve out on your website that marks this content as archived, either as a special web page or as a particular spot on the web page. So you're going to have to clearly define, what's considered archived. And again, this is not meant for things that are going to be updated. Just be mindful of that. Even if something is archived and you're allowed to archive it, if it's still out there publicly and a member of the public needs effective communication to able to, read the content, you do have general obligations under the ADA to, as an accommodation, to provide an accessible format for that individual trying to access that stuff. So you may want to take this opportunity to do some housekeeping, looking at what you have on the website that's no longer needed. I know we love, at least here in the state, we love to post PDFs and word processing documents, but you really kind of want to take a look at that and make sure that, is this really actively being used? Do we need to take this down? Is this really necessary? Or even, is this even the best kind of format versus HTML? The last thing we have here, and again, there's a couple more exemptions, but it's a third it's content posted by third parties. Basically, what this means is if you have sort of a forum on your website that the members of the public can post to, you still have obligations to make sure that that platform is accessible. However, you can't really control what members of the public post on there. So if they're posting pictures or making comments, you're not really under control of those individuals posting content, to that forum. This does not mean that any third party is exempt. If you're hiring a third party or a vendor that is serving as an agent for your entity, um, this exemption does not apply. So I think that's it. And I will pass it off to Lilia, who will tell you a little bit about some resources that we have surrounding accessibility. So thank you.
Thank you, Rob. I'm going to fly through these pretty quickly. I know Jonathan has a lot of information for you guys. All right, so first, a few resources around effective communication. MOD on our webpage has a guidance page all about effective communication and your legal obligations. We also have pages and a recorded training specific to hosting accessible events and meetings. These are really, really helpful. We have checklists for things to look for in in-person venues, virtual event platforms, and special considerations for hybrid events, including checklists for things to tell your speakers ahead of time. That sort of thing kind of covers everything about events, but including effective communication. The New England ADA Center is also a really great resource to learn more about your legal obligations. I'm sure many of you already are familiar with them. They've got the Title II Action Guide that goes over all of your legal requirements, but also a special section on effective communication. We also have a ton of resources on digital accessibility. These slides will be sent around to everybody. If you weren't able to access them in the email I sent this morning, I know some people had some issues with that. We will remedy that in the follow-up email, and you'll be able to access all of these links. So several resources around legal compliance from MOD and from the Department of Justice. So we have a recorded training on the new rules that Rob just mentioned. ITS 61 is the statewide contract for accessibility consulting services, if you're looking for that. And then I think these are all from the Department of Justice, a fact sheet, some first steps with tips on complying with those new rules. And then resource for procurement. The IT Acquisition Access Compliance Program has some sample procurement language and guidance on accessibility when procuring IT services. And then finally, for evaluating the accessibility of your websites, there's a great web accessibility evaluation guide. MOD has put together some resources on creating accessible digital documents. We have a video series on our YouTube channel that's very short, bite-sized videos on sort of the basic things you need to know about the basic principles of creating accessible digital documents. Good font colors, clear heading structures, that sort of thing. That video series, there's 4 parts to it right now. We're planning on adding more. And we also have a guidance page on our website. So those are about accessible like Word documents, but some of those principles also apply to websites and kind of across the board for digital accessibility in general. For PowerPoint presentations, accessible screen sharing, and audio description resources, we have links for those as well. And then just another reminder about our municipal ADA improvement grant. So this is funding to municipalities for accessibility planning, ADA self-evaluation and transition plans, and then also we have project grants, which is funding for improvements or barrier removal related to physical and communication accessibility. So all Massachusetts municipalities are eligible to apply for this grant, and also municipally owned properties and housing authorities and school districts. So the grant application opens May 1st. You can go to our website to our grant page and actually look at the application now so you can get an idea of what you'll need. And we also have 3 information sessions coming up. The next one's tomorrow, April 15th. We also have one on April 23rd and May 19th after the application opens in case you still have questions. So municipalities who are here, I really encourage you to check this out. And again, this is for planning, architectural accessibility, but also communication accessibility. So if you want to purchase any of the assistive technology that Jonathan's going to go through today to improve your effective communication, those would be eligible for the grant. All right, and then finally, if you have any questions for us, you can read our guidance on disability rights. mass.gov/mod/disability rights is home to our effective communication page, but also a ton of other topics: employment, housing, government services. Always visit our events page for our upcoming trainings, which are all free. Sign up for our email list. You all should be on that already. And to call us for one-on-one guidance, we have our regular office hours for municipal ADA coordinators and also state ADA coordinators. If you are not aware of those, you don't have them on your calendar, reach out to me. I can send you a link. But you can also contact us anytime with your questions at mass.gov/mod/contact. And I will now hand it over to Jonathan.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to make a sound check and make sure that everybody can hear me. You can, great. I know this is a funny question coming from a deaf person, but I always get to ask because I've been in so many meetings where somebody's muted without realizing it. Thank you, first of all, for that great introduction by my colleagues at MOD. I am really thankful that you invited me to be part of your presentation today, and I hope that I'm going to bring you some interesting and informative materials. One thing I want to say right off the bat that's not in my presentation is that I don't want this to be an intimidating thing for anybody who participates. The hard truth is we all learn as we go along. And I can tell you from experience, having been at MCDHH for nearly 33 years now, I can tell you there are still things that we ourselves don't do perfectly right. So don't be intimidated if you think, wow, this is a lot of information, and how am I possibly going to incorporate all of that? You have MOD, you have MCDHH, you've got a lot of people there to guide you. And as I said, we ourselves are still learning. It's a constantly evolving process. The technology changes, the expectations change, the regulations change. So there's always something new and interesting to learn. So please don't feel intimidated by anything you're going to learn, okay? And please reach out to me at any time if you have any more specific questions. So I also come from a very much, I would say, evidence and best practices based perspective. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a doctor. I do frequently touch on things that have to do with law or that have to do with some sort of medical background, but I am not a doctor and not a lawyer. And again, best practices is whatever works for the individual, which Camille already was very kind to elaborate on, so I'm not going to go over that too much again. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have a communication protocol today, and the communication protocol is that we've already discussed that we're going to be taking questions at the end in order to keep things flowing smoothly, which is a little bit of a departure of how I normally do it. I normally ask people to just ask me whatever, but we will be doing that at the end. We do have a card provider today, and I hope that most of you are familiar with how a card provider works. Something that I realized too late to make any changes to the presentation, we are now starting to call, well, they are now starting to call themselves card captioners. Because when you think about it, when somebody says you need to get a card provider, people say, what's a card provider? What's a cart? Because people associate cards with, you know, things with four wheels on them and a horse in front. And that's not what it is. It's actually a captioning service. So the National Court Reporters Association themselves has now said that they want to refer to the service as card captioners going forward. And luckily today we have an excellent card captioner with us today, Mona, who is providing the captions that you may see. And if you haven't already seen them, you can either see them through a separate stream text link, or you can look at them on the caption box in the Zoom account. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so I think we can pretty much skip that, but The important thing to realize is there's so much variability. There's no way anybody can give a presentation that's going to meet everyone's needs. I have been to pretty much every community in the Commonwealth at some point in my career. And some people ask me to come in and say, how do we make this accessible? And when they say this, they're talking about a tiny room that's got 5 people where there's no microphone, no speaker system, no nothing. And other communities have huge auditoriums with very fancy audiovisual setups and microphones and all that. So it's a very, very individual question. How do you make something accessible so that it meets the needs of the various people living in that community? And the other thing I want to say, and I'm going to say this over and over again, it depends a lot on what the individual needs of the person are. And something I did not put in this presentation, and this is something really important. The needs of an individual can change over time. I grew up as a hearing person. Then I became ill from meningitis, lost all of my hearing. Wore hearing aids for a long time. The hearing aids were helpful, but I got to the point where hearing aids stopped being helpful to me. So I switched to cochlear implants, which you can, if you can see them, I have them on right now. And for me personally, that was an excellent choice for me to make as somebody who had grown up in the hearing world. And they have helped me a lot. So my accessibility needs, even though I'm the same person, the same human being, my accessibility needs have changed from time to time. And I predict they will change again because my eyesight is getting significantly worse. So at some point, I'm probably going to have to contend with more eyesight-related problems than just hearing-related problems. So if somebody shows up to you in this moment with these particular needs, that does not mean that they can't show up 6 months later or a year later with different needs. And we are, of course, not constrained by any kind of a strange law that we only have to have one disability. I know many people who have multiple disabilities, which can make it a bit of a challenge to make sure that you meet all of the individual's needs. And one thing I highly recommend is that you set up a local committee or task force so that the people and the government can speak to each other. So individuals with disabilities can bring to state government, these are our issues. And state government, local government can respond and say, we hear you. This is what we plan to do. Does it make sense? And have this kind of a dialogue. First of all, you're going to get to meet the people in your community who have hearing loss, who are deaf, who are hard of hearing, who are late deafened. And secondly, you're going to find solutions to provide accommodation to meet everybody's needs. Next slide, please. So I'm going to be very brief about this. We are a tiny agency. We have about 56 people currently, I believe. We've been around since 1985. Our current commissioner is Dr. Opeolua Sotonwa, a very nice gentleman. And one thing that he said right at the beginning, which touched me deeply, was he said, there is no one way to be deaf. And that's something really important. I believe that myself. And again, it goes back to what I said in the beginning. Even we at the Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing don't always get it right when it comes to providing communication access. So we are always learning just as much as you are. And when we find out something new that works for most of us, we share it out with other people so that other people can learn from that. So we have a couple of different departments. I'm Communication Access Training and Technology Services. And as the name implies, I'm a technology specialist, and I also go out to do trainings. For example, very recently, I went to Pittsfield for 6 weeks in a row. Every Wednesday, I trained the police department on how to provide communication access. I also in the past have provided training to Pittsfield municipal personnel on how to make their services accessible. And we provide training, we provide education, we provide technical assistance. We also manage our website and we create accessible videos, meaning with caption, often with ASL. So that is what the CATS department does. We also have a community services or community navigation department, which is basically social work. So if you realize in the course of your duties that you are running into a deaf person who's got some severe life needs and doesn't seem to be able to manage those needs independently, by all means, refer them to us. Our referral service is very simple. If everything else fails, email me. I'm also the person who answers general inquiries from our website. So if you just go to the contact to the commission and put a question in there, it's likely going to get to me, and then I can refer to the person who needs it. We also have a very large interpreter and card captioner referral service program, which is called the Communication Access Division. And what that means is if you need sign language interpreters or card captioners for your jobs, you call us to arrange that. And our referral people are very skilled in asking you all the necessary questions that they are going to need from you in order to provide the effective communication access. Because that by itself is an art and a science. I've actually had people call me and say, hey, Jonathan, can you help me get an ASL interpreter? I need an ASL interpreter. And I'm sitting there on the phone and I'm wondering, why is this person who can hear me on the phone, who is speaking to me, requesting an ASL interpreter? And I say to them, I'm sorry to ask, but do you know what an ASL interpreter is? And they say, not really, except it helps with hearing. So sometimes people don't know what they're asking for. Somebody who doesn't know ASL will not be helped by an ASL interpreter. People generally have ideas that an ASL provider, or I mean interpreter, I'm sorry, or a card captioner is something that's going to be useful, but they don't necessarily understand how it's actually going to apply to them in the moment. So that was kind of a learning experience for me to never make assumptions that somebody necessarily knows what they're asking for. But we will always provide you with the appropriate, a screened and certified ASL interpreter and or card captioner or certified deaf interpreter. We're going to go into that a little bit later. We also have the substance use disorder service, and what that is currently, and that's been under a lot of flux with some of the changes that we're seeing at the federal level, about that is 10 recovery coaches who themselves have gone through the recovery process, who are bilingual in English and American Sign Language and understand the needs of deaf and hard of hearing people, who are able to go out into the community and help people who are themselves struggling with substance use disorders. We also make some of the bigger meetings from AA, Al-Anon accessible, because these meetings are not helpful if there is no accessibility provided. So if you know somebody who's struggling with substance use disorder, please refer them to us. Next slide, please. Here are some important links. I would encourage you to look through them. I also have a QR code on the bottom right. And if you point your phone at that, you will come to our interpreter request website, specifically where you can ask for ASL interpreters and card captioners. And the link is underneath it as well. The other thing I want to speak about very briefly is our COVID-19 visual tool. That is something that is a little bit out of date. So we all remember COVID, right? And COVID disproportionately hit elderly people in the beginning, people who were older, who were isolated, who depended on having a communication support around them, and who were suddenly cut off from that communication support. So we thought, what can we do? And we came up with a visual icons card to allow medical professionals to download that onto their devices and to basically use these visual icons and with the text underneath to be able to communicate basic concepts back and forth with somebody who might not have any other way of communicating. And it was a smash hit. It got translated into 8 different languages. It was used in 5 different countries and in 22 states. And we came up with it in the span of 2 weeks after COVID hit. So we are still very proud of this. And we say, you know, we get so stuck in our modalities of communication sometimes that we forget that there are alternate methods of communicating. For example, if you are confronted with somebody who is deaf, who is signing to you, and you cannot in the moment get an ASL interpreter, there is usually a way that you can effectively communicate with this person just using visual gestural communication. And that's something that we often forget because we're so focused on hearing and speaking that we forget these alternate methods of communication. And then we expanded that into the visor card for law enforcement. And that is something that every police officer in the Commonwealth should by now be having in their car, that allows them to take it and communicate with a deaf or hard of hearing person in a non-verbal way quickly and effectively at the roadside. It is not a perfect communication tool. It was never designed to be. It was something that was designed to bring somebody out of that dangerous roadside situation with a minimum of time so the police officer can say, this is why I pulled you over. This is what you did. Can I see your license? Can I see your registration? On the other side, it's got something where the deaf or hard of hearing person can point to and says, I need an interpreter. I need a captioner. I need text, and be able to show that. And again, it's just there for best practices in the moment. And I always say, you know, when you bring somebody back to the station or you bring somebody to the hospital, that is where you then have to engage the full spectrum of communication access. Because currently there's no way to do that on the roadside, and it's dangerous, and we want to get people out of those situations. Please take a look at all of these resources and download them if possible, and share them with your first responders so they have access to them as well. Next slide, please. So the demographics are kind of eye-opening. 20% of any given population in any given community, average community, have a hearing loss. So obviously, if you are in a community that's heavily skewed towards senior citizens, that percentage is going to go way up. And that percentage is actually pretty eye-popping for people who have no idea how many people with hearing loss down in the Commonwealth. We estimate there's at least 1.4 million. And we say at least because we are going by the average population. So that's actually a national figure, and to some extent, it's an international figure in comparable countries. It is not really applicable to, say, very young countries, like some countries in Africa, for example, Kenya. I used to live in Kenya, so I can talk about that. The population there is much younger, generally speaking, than the population in the United States, which means that basically the population doesn't have that age-related impact of hearing loss. So there it's probably a lot less than 20%. But basically, if you're ever wondering how many people in your own community have a hearing loss, you should take the number of population, figure out what 20% are, and you're going to be surprised how many people there are. We don't see people with hearing loss. And I make this point very often. When I have my implants on, you can see I've got a visible disability. The moment I take them off, I have an invisible disability. And of course, a deaf person who doesn't have hearing aids, who doesn't have cochlear implants, isn't going to walk down the street signing to themselves. So you can walk by 20 or 30 people a day who are deaf, and you wouldn't even necessarily know it unless they started signing with somebody. Then you would possibly see, oh, this is a deaf person. But the numbers are pretty staggering. Next slide, please. You want to be proactively accessible, and this is something that was already mentioned by Camille. Thank you for that. Basically, we expect no accessibility. Okay, so I've had a hearing loss for what, about 50 years now, and I have been, whether I like it or not, I have been trained not to expect much from the hearing world. And as a result, I will look at flyers very often that announce an event, and if I don't specifically see something that calls out that this is going to be made accessible, I'm going to ignore it because I'm going to make an assumption that it's not accessible. And very often I still see things being put out without any thought about, you know, announcing any kind of routine accessibility or giving people a contact that you could reach out to with sufficient time to allow for somebody to request reasonable accommodation. And again, if you're trying to include people with disabilities in your decision-making process, it's vital that you have communication access. I cannot tell you how often I have been in meetings that are specific to deaf and hard of hearing people where nobody says anything about accessibility being provided. And it is, to me, mind-blowing that you would even consider that. And that's particularly important if you ask me when it comes to emergencies. Well, how will you communicate with people who are deaf and hard of hearing in your community in emergency setting? There's a water main break. We have to boil water. There's a snow emergency. I once got my car towed because the city decided to drive through, the city where I live decided to drive through with loudspeakers. And this was before the internet. So now that the internet's there, it's a little bit better. But they decided to drive through announcing through loudspeakers that there was a snow emergency. Loudspeaker doesn't work for deaf people. I didn't hear it. I got ticketed, and then I got towed. And I first thought my car had been stolen. By the time I found out it had been towed and I complained about it, I was stuck having to pay for the tow fee. So there are things like that that still happen. We just don't always hear about it. So think about, how am I going to communicate proactively with the people in my community so I don't get into those situations in the first place. Next slide, please. Yeah, you want to be careful with planning public events. Again, Camille and Rob both talked about that a little bit, but you want to make sure that you mention what are we providing already automatically. And you use the icons for that. If you have this icon for interpreters, put that icon for interpreters on the publication. There is no corresponding icon that I'm aware of for CARD. There's been a couple that have been floated. I have not seen any of them be officially accepted, but CARD captioner is the appropriate verbiage to use. And basically put an email there, not a phone number, because a phone number can be a little bit inaccessible. You can put a phone number there, but you should also put an email so the person can contact you and say, hey, it's great that you're providing ASL and CARD, but I need a certified deaf interpreter, or I need a deaf blind interpreter, which is a different thing altogether, which requires some specialization. So make sure that people have the opportunity to tell you that in advance. And the one thing I will say, it's a little bit disturbing. I sometimes wonder if people make requests for interpreters and card providers late on purpose so they don't have to meet them. Because by now it should be pretty well known we have a national interpreter and card captioner shortage, meaning you have to make the requests the moment you get them, as quickly as possible. And I have known some communities where somebody makes a request and then 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, it still hasn't been made to us, or for the best to our knowledge, not to anybody else either. And that could get you into hot water, because somebody could make a case that the request is not being made on purpose because somebody doesn't want to meet it. So when you get a request, make it ASAP. I want to say something else quickly. There is no law that says you have to go to the Massachusetts Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing to get interpreters. If you know of an interpreter who is qualified and certified in your community, there is nothing stopping you from reaching out to that particular interpreter or interpreters and saying, would you be able to do this? Especially this can be useful if it's a really literally last minute thing and you happen to know somebody, you might actually be better off calling that person directly first and saying, are you available to do this? Okay, but you have to make sure again that this person is appropriate to do the job, which can be sometimes a little bit tricky. Next slide, please. Yeah, I want to talk also about one-on-one, because a lot of state government happens one-on-one. You send somebody to somebody's home, you go to talk to somebody, you still have to provide reasonable accommodation, whether on-site or remotely. So make sure that you do that. There is no reason in the world why you cannot provide just as effective communication one-on-one as you can to a broader audience. It's basically just scaling down the accessibility that you already have. And something else I want to say very briefly, I want to talk brief, and this gets complicated. There are different standards, and I believe that both Camille and Rob talked about that a little bit. I call something a, how do I say this? I, as a person with hearing loss, determine what works for me. Okay, so if I'm going for a medical consultation, say at the hospital, I'm going to require the non-plus ultra, so to speak, of communication access. I am going to ask for a professional card captioner, like the one we have today, to be present, whether on-site or remotely, to help me understand exactly what the doctor is saying. When, on the other hand, I am having an impromptu conversation that doesn't involve life-altering or critical medical information or anything like that, I might say, you know what, can we use speech recognition technology? And I'm holding up what I'm doing right now, which I always have running even when I have card. I have a speech recognition app on my phone. I usually bring my phone with me to meetings. With my cochlear implants, I function well enough to understand most people, but every once in a while I miss something, so I make the decision for myself. I am going to use this And it is a decision that you can make also. You can bring this kind of technology with you and say, we have it available if you want to avail yourself of it, because many people don't know this exists. And then once they know that it exists, they might be okay with that, or they might ask for card captioning, but it's up to the individual. Next slide, please. Some stereotypes, and I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. One of them is that deaf people can't speak, which is not true. Deaf people can speak. The speech may sound different depending on when they lost their hearing, and most deaf people choose not to speak, but to communicate in American Sign Language, which is one of the reasons why captioning during a conversation is not necessarily a good fit for a culturally deaf person, because even if they can read perfect English, which not all culturally deaf people can do, they're going to want to respond to you in American Sign Language, and a card captioner doesn't do that. So that would not be the appropriate way to accommodate somebody who is culturally deaf and used ASL. But deaf people can speak. It just, again, sounds different, and deaf people have learned from experience that they're better off signing. All deaf people sign? No, they do not. Sign language is not something that pops into your head once you become deaf. It is something that requires learning, like any other language. And it requires, in fact, in order for you to be fluent in sign language, it takes 2 to 4 years of dedicated study at the minimum to become fluent in American Sign Language. So it's not something that's easy or accessible. Fingerspelling is, and that's helpful. Anything you do to make yourself more accessible is always warmly appreciated, but don't have any fantasies about the fact that, every deaf person knows sign language or that you can learn it in a matter of weeks. It's really not something that's that easy. And all deaf people can speech read? No, they cannot. Speech reading is very difficult. Even when you have ideal conditions and you are enunciating and you're facing somebody and the light's on you and you don't have facial hair and you're not moving your head away and you're not covering your hands, it's still a pretty hard thing to do. So you cannot treat speech reading as a reasonable accommodation. It is not. It has nothing to do with reasonable accommodation. And believe it or not, I've actually seen people say that. I've said to them, well, I'm offering you speech reading as a reasonable accommodation. It is not a reasonable accommodation. It's something that some people are good at, some people are not good at, and all of us do it to some extent. If you remember how you felt with people starting wearing masks at COVID, you probably felt very uncomfortable. So that should be a reminder to you of how much is taken away when you can't see somebody's lips. Hearing aids and cochlear implants do not fix hearing. They are tools. They help people to hear better. Every once in a while, somebody sees me and sees my implants and says, why do we have to provide captioning for you as well? We thought you were fixed. And I say, I'm not fixed. I'm a deaf person. I'm always going to be a deaf person. Even with these, I do not hear perfectly. I still require additional accommodations depending on the subject matter, the complexity, etc. But that's my decision. That's not usually your decision to make. That's my decision to make what I am going to need on top of my already available cochlear implant. So speaking louder doesn't necessarily help. When you speak louder, you're exaggerating your mouth movements. And when you speak louder, you're also drawing attention to yourself and the other person, which is not always helpful. So please do not necessarily yell or speak loudly. Instead, get an assistive listening system that allows you to speak at a regular tone of voice, regular volume, and the other person can amplify it as they need it, not you're having to speak loudly. And remember that when you're speaking loudly, you are potentially violating the other person's confidentiality. The flip side of that nobody ever talks about, sometimes hard of hearing people speak very loudly because they can't hear themselves. And it would be nice if you could make them aware of the fact that they might be violating their own confidentiality because they're speaking so loudly. That's just a pro tip for all of you. The other, of course, trope is that only old people lose their hearing. I lost my hearing when I was 9 years old due to disease. Many people lose their hearings very early. They can be born deaf. They can acquire hearing loss shortly after birth. There's all sorts of reasons why somebody can lose their hearing. Yes, there is a connection to aging. By the time you're 60 years old, you've got a 30% chance of a hearing loss. By the time you're 80, 85 years old, that chance of hearing loss goes up to about 50%. So yes, of course, there is an association with aging, but it doesn't just happen to older people. That's really important, and that's part of what causes the stigma of hearing loss. It's associated with infirmity, with aging, and with intellectual weakness, because very often people pretend they just stop responding to you because they don't understand they're being spoken to, they don't understand what you're saying, so they start withdrawing. So it's really important that you get around that stigma somehow and involve people, especially people with hearing loss, into their affairs. And deaf and hard of hearing people are less educated, intelligent, capable? No. What is true is, however, that information that is not explicitly made accessible for a deaf and hard of hearing person is not usually known to that deaf and hard of hearing person. That's a very important point. If you don't make something accessible for somebody, they will not know that it exists. They will not know the information you're sharing if it's in a format that they can't benefit from. Next slide, please. Yes, the wording is important. You want to say deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf blind. You do not want to say deaf and dumb, deaf mute, and hearing impaired. Hearing impaired is particularly pernicious. People who are hard of hearing themselves often refer to themselves to being hearing impaired. And I always ask people, give me one example in which the word impaired has a positive connotation. There is none. It's always a negative connotation, particularly when a hearing person uses this against somebody who is hard of hearing. So please try not to use the word hearing impaired. Say hard of hearing instead. To you, it may not matter, but it matters to me. And believe it or not, it will matter to people once they stop referring to themselves as being hearing impaired and call themselves hard of hearing. That's a much more neutral and accessible language to use. And the other thing to do is not make jokes about selective hearing. That is really I know it's kind of fallen out of favor these days, but I'm still going to say it. It's a microaggression. Oh, yeah, you only hear when you want to. If you say this to me often enough, I'm going to stop telling you that I can't hear you. I don't think that's funny anymore. I stopped thinking that about, I would say 45 years ago. And the other thing is, it doesn't matter. It's not important. It's not something appropriate. Everybody with a hearing loss has the right to understand what you're saying, and they're asking you because, and you should be flattered by this, they're asking you because they want to understand you. And for you to then respond, it's not important, is kind of a put down. So I would suggest you not use that. Next slide, please. Yep, focus on the individual. In the rare event you meet another Austrian, bald, glasses-wearing, cochlear-implanted person like myself, don't assume that they have my communication needs or my communication abilities. I'm fortunate. I can use American Sign Language, I can speech read, I can read, I can write, I can do all these things. I am fortunate in my abilities. Not everybody shares all of those abilities. Some people exceed my abilities. Everybody is an individual. And that also has to do with treatment of people, and this is important. I see this happening all the time, where somebody has a bad experience with a deaf person or with a hard of hearing person, and then the next time they're confronted with a deaf person or hard of hearing person, they think, oh boy, here we go again. Everybody is different. If you have a bad experience with one person, that's that person you had a bad experience with. It's not the deaf community you've had a bad experience with, or it's that hard of hearing person you've had a bad experience with. That's really important. And make sure, again, to ask the person, what do you need for me to improve communication? People are not offended by that. They're flattered by that. They will happily tell you what they need, and they will happily tell you what has worked for them in the past and what has not worked for them in the past. Next slide, please. So this really quickly, I always try to explain to people when somebody says, I'm deaf, that doesn't really tell me a whole lot. I ask more questions. I say, okay, you say you're deaf, and often these are people who are speaking will say that to me, I'm deaf. So I'm like, oh, okay, what's your communication preference? What does that mean, deaf? Because the way most people use the word deaf, it could be anything. It could be somebody who has a mild hearing loss, it could be somebody who is standing in front of you using sign language to communicate with other people because that's what they use. So it's really important to define what are we talking about here. I say to people, when you tell me you've got a deaf person in front of you, what are they doing? Are they speaking to you? Are they signing to you? Are they making motions of writing back and forth? What are they doing? Because that's something that tells me more about the individual's needs. So don't assume that somebody is deaf. On the left, you see this big bulb that says deaf, and that's how most people view deafness. I also wanted to point out that deaf, the way the hearing world uses it, is not a positive word. It is a medical pathological term that denotes a disability, an inability of some kind. And that's not how culturally deaf people who use American Sign Language view themselves or view the word deaf. They view themselves as a cultural and linguistic minority, not as a grouping of individuals with disabilities. Next slide, please. So let's understand the word deaf better. So deaf individuals consider themselves a distinct social and cultural group with a shared sign language. Okay, they do not view their being deaf as the disability. They view the failure of the hearing world to provide them with reasonable accommodation as being the disabling condition. That's how they see that. ASL is not a visual translation of English. It's its own language with its own grammar, its own syntax. So you cannot word for word translate ASL into English. And one example I give you that always befuddles people, they might want to make an ASL video of somebody speaking, and they also have the voice going, and somebody can speak a sentence that is maybe 10 seconds long, and the ASL interpretation may last 35 seconds because it's not word for word. It's a conceptual interpretation. Or conversely, the ASL could be 10 seconds and the person could be speaking for 35 seconds. And so that's something you have to keep in mind when you're producing accessible media. You have to think about those kind of things. It doesn't mean the interpretation is incorrect. You're not doing word for word interpretation. You're taking one language and converting it into a completely different language that has no relation to the source language. And ASL is required through exposure and practice. And again, like I said earlier, it can take 2 to 4 years for somebody to become fluent. And not everybody who is deaf knows ASL. Deaf people themselves have to be exposed to ASL in some form, some organized form in order for them to learn it. It's not like you go to sleep hearing, you wake up deaf, and magically you have ASL skills. That's not the way it works. And that's something that, believe it or not, many hearing people seem to believe that everybody who is deaf knows ASL, and that's not true. And you will need to provide an appropriately credentialed ASL interpreter for interaction with somebody who tells you that they are deaf and provide interpreters. Here's something I want to say that's really important. Don't second guess what somebody tells you are their needs. That's a really good way of getting into trouble. I remember not too long ago, a hospital got into trouble. Why? Because of one particular individual who worked for the hospital who was insistent that a deaf blind patient, now I'm saying this again, a deaf blind patient, somebody who could not hear and somebody who could not see, who had, by the way, total vision loss, should be using the accommodation the hospital provided, which was a video remote interpreter. Yes, you heard that right. Somebody at the hospital was expecting a deaf-blind individual to look at the screen and understand what the remote interpreter was signing on it. And to somebody like you and me, that might sound inconceivable, but unfortunately, this happens every single day because people make assumptions. We have this, so therefore we will provide it. No. What you should be doing is you should be asking, what do you need? And then provide that, not based on what you already have, but what the person needs. Next slide, please. So writing back and forth does not work for somebody whose first language is American Sign Language, because guess what? They may not be fluent in English. And I do want to say that this presentation is very general. There are some deaf people who are excellent at English, but that still does not mean that writing back and forth is necessarily the appropriate way of communication, because there's no way that you are going to cover the same breadth of material in a written communication as you would in a verbal communication. You're going to be much shorter in written communication, which is not really equivalent communication. So that is something you really want to be careful for. And you have to make sure that you do not think of other solutions as being acceptable unless the person explicitly tells you they are. For example, the app that I use when I interact with people, when I have nothing else with me and I have difficulty understanding them, I use an app called Live Transcribe. It's a built-in functionality on my Android phone, which is why I have an Android phone. And it gives you the opportunity for me to be able to read what somebody else is saying and then typing my response back. But remember, this is something that I might be able to do, or more likely, I should speak my response back since I can speak. But that's where the individuality of the person comes into play. Not everybody can do that. So just because it works for me doesn't mean it's going to work for the next person you encounter. Next slide, please. Yep, so Camille already spoke about this. Rob already spoke about this. You always offer American Sign Language interpreters as RSVP options when you publicize upcoming events. Now, something we did not talk about, not everybody who is deaf knows American Sign Language. For example, there are people from other parts of the world who live in the United States who may or may not know a different sign language based on their country of origin, because every sign language is different. ASL is not a universal language. Even in the United States, there's some variability in different regional signs. So, for example, if you're using a remote interpreter, I would caution you to use a remote interpreter who is from the New England area. You should probably not engage a remote interpreter who is from Washington State or Idaho or something like that, because they are probably going to sign differently enough to throw somebody a little bit off who has grown up in New England area and is particularly familiar with New England signs. So there is some variability. But again, British Sign Language is completely different from American Sign Language, for example. We have Australian Sign Language, we have British Sign Language, we have American Sign Language, we have Canadian Sign Language. They're all different from each other. Even Austria, Germany, and Switzerland, which all speak German, have 3 different sign languages. They may be a little bit related, but not necessarily. So you have to provide what's called a certified deaf interpreter when somebody is in front of you who is deaf, but who doesn't sign ASL. And a certified deaf interpreter is an individual who is specialized. They're deaf themselves. They're native signers, meaning they've grown up in ASL. But I just said that this person may not know ASL. Right? But the certified deaf interpreter knows ASL and knows how to convey the message through visual gestural interpretation, which means you might need 2 interpreters. So you're going to be speaking, you're going to need an ASL interpreter who takes your speech, translates it to the ASL, and then there's going to be the deaf interpreter who takes that ASL and converts it into visual gestural communication that does not necessarily require the knowledge of American Sign Language for this person to understand. And this person then is going to gesture and sign back, which the the certified deaf interpreter is going to take that information, convert it back into ASL for the benefit of the ASL interpreter to then voice it to you. And for that, you need a team approach. You always need an ASL interpreter and a certified deaf interpreter to work together. And that, by the way, is fairly common in Western Massachusetts. We get a lot of requests for CDIs. And yes, it is something that the Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing provides. So if somebody ever reaches out to you with a special request and says, I need a CDI, you now know what that is and where to get it. They can both be provided on-site or remote, meaning the interpreter can be right in front of you or the interpreter can be on screen. If only one interpreter is available in this kind of a team approach, if only one interpreter is available on-site, that should be the certified deaf interpreter, should be on-site with who they're providing services with. That's really important. And again, make ASL requests with sufficient notice, because I can guarantee you something. If you're going to call me 2 days and lead time, we will probably not be able to fill the request. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to talk briefly about telecommunications and video conferencing. Next slide, please. Here you see a visual of a telecommunication device for the deaf. Now, most everybody knows what that is. It looks like a little typewriter with an LED display, a little flashing strobe light that signifies an incoming phone call. And on the top, it has what appears to be two people who actually thought these were coffee cup holders. They're not, the acoustic couplers. I am I hate to say it to you because many people think, oh, we're in compliance, we've got a TDY. A TDY is pretty much yesterday's news. Uh, if you can see a TDY in front of you, you will see something that requires somebody the ability to be able to type on an English keyboard. And if you remember what I said moments ago about ASL having no relation to English, you can see the TDY was popular when there was nothing else available. But as soon as the internet was sufficiently robust to allow for visual communication between two people, everybody switched over to video phone so that people can actually use their native language, which is American Sign Language, to sign back and forth with other people. And that's also when the first relay services started. And the first relay services took over from the Massachusetts relay, which is basically, which still exists, which allows somebody with a TTY to call somebody else who doesn't have one by going through a relay operator who reads on screen and speaks to the other person and then types the information back. That still exists, but most people today do not use this anymore. And this comes up frequently in a municipal environment because people will say to me, are we still required to provide a TTY? And I say generally, no, you are not, because the intent was never to keep people with old and outdated technology. And the spirit of the ADA is that you have to provide what's reasonable accommodation. Today, I tell you, if you gave a deaf person a TTY and you said to them, call your deaf family member at home, they probably wouldn't be able to do it anymore because the deaf family at home have probably switched to video relay service and no longer use TTYs themselves, which has implications for local police departments, for example. If you're going to give me a TTY, that's awesome, but who am I going to call with that? Even though I have a deaf family, I'm not going to call my deaf family with a TTY because they don't have a TTY anymore. So just be aware that this is kind of, it's not completely gone, and some people will still use it, but relatively few people use the TTY. Next slide, please. So here is a couple of images that show, for example, on iMac screen, they show a laptop, they show smartphones, they show tablets, and they show a monitor with a webcam on top, which is a full-fledged video camera, just as a reminder that a video phone and video phone relay and video remote interpreting can be offered on standalone devices as well as everyday devices when you download the appropriate communications app to it. And if you're using video relay service, you have to be a certified deaf or hard of hearing individual because the Federal Communications Commission funds the providers of video relay service, and as such, they require proof that they are providing video relay service specifically to those people who need it. Next slide, please. This is a sign. This is basically a schematic. I apologize for it. It's a little bit low resolution. What it actually shows is it shows a deaf person signing on a video phone to the relay operator who is in the middle, who sees the deaf person signing and who has a headset on and who speaks on the headset to the hearing person whom the deaf person is conversing with. And then it shows the hearing person speaking back and the interpreter hearing them on headphones and signing that information back to a deaf person. Video relay service is seamless and very efficient and very popular. It's also available in Spanish, and it is available at no cost to yourselves or to the deaf person. If a deaf person gives you a phone number, it's very likely going to be the video relay service number, which means you have to do nothing special. You basically dial that number on any device you have, and you will automatically, from the system recognizing this as a video relay call, will automatically generate the appearance of an interpreter between yourself and the other person, so you don't have to call them to get an interpreter to call them, but call the deaf person directly with their video phone number. Okay, next slide, please. On the left is a picture of video relay service. And on the right is a picture of video remote interpreting. So video relay service, again, is telecommunication based only, and there is no charge for you using that. If, on the other hand, say you're interviewing candidates for a job and a deaf person comes in for a job and you are not able to provide an on-site interpreter, which may happen in the more remote municipalities, you have to provide a remote interpreter. You are responsible for the cost of the remote interpreter. So in this case, you would be interviewing a deaf person. You would have a large screen in front of you, and I'm not blocking you, of course, but next to you, and the deaf person would be sitting across from you and looking at both you and the interpreter on screen to understand what it is that you're saying. And then when the deaf person signs back, the interpreter will be voicing that for the benefit of the person doing the interview. But there are two different systems, even though they use pretty indistinguishable technologies. One of them is paid for by the federal government, and one of them is not. You cannot use video relay service to take the place of an in-site interpreter. It gets even more confusing because some of the video relay service providers are now also offering video remote interpreting, which of course makes sense, but you need to know which to use when. So if you have any questions about that, please do contact me and I will be happy to talk you through it more. But I hope that this has given you some general idea about what the differences are. For telecommunication purposes, use video relay service. For in-person or video remote interpreting, you are responsible to pay for the cost of the interpreter. Next slide, please. And the technology for video, I'm going to summarize this slide super short. You have to have really good broadband, and you should be considering things like visual privacy because American Sign Language is a very visible language. If somebody is using American Sign Language 5 tables down, I can understand what they're saying. There's no privacy in ASL, so you should consider, if you ever want to, you can consider offering public video phone service. Many relay service providers will be happy to assist you in that, but make sure you consider things like video privacy and good lighting and the availability of signage so people know that you're even offering this service, and make sure that there is fantastic connectivity, because if you put them onto a public Wi-Fi system where the internet speeds are very slow, it is not going to help. The video has to be fluid and smooth and flawless, and so does the audio in order for that to work. Next slide, please. And accessible video conferencing, like you see here today, is very easy. We have added interpreters, and interpreters can be spotlighted so they become the predominant squares in the video display for the benefit of the deaf individuals, which is very helpful because when we first started after COVID coming out with all these web conferences, the interpreters would hop all over the place and a deaf person would panic trying to figure out where did my interpreter go. So now we do spotlighting or pinning to make sure that only the person who is signing is visible for everybody else, but it's extremely easy to add somebody. Next slide, please. Now, another category of deafness is, well, not deafness as a condition, another category of being deaf is that of being deafblind, and that depends tremendously on the individual themselves, because deafblind doesn't necessarily always mean totally deaf and totally blind. Some people may have some hearing and some people might have some vision, so it's really important you engage with the individual to find out what do they need. And there are several different types of communication access you can use with a deaf-blind person. One is called closed vision interpreting, where the interpreter sits close to the deaf-blind person, usually with a light on them and signs small so that the deaf-blind person can see them more easily. And others require tactile interpreting, where an interpreter who is trained to provide tactile interpreting will also sign relatively small, and the deaf-blind person will have the hands resting on top of the hands of the interpreter so they can read what is being signed to them. And then, of course, when the deaf-blind person responds, they're not going to need that anymore. They can expressively sign for themselves, and some may even speak for themselves, but they might require a tactile interpretation through a specialized deaf-blind interpreter. So this is the kind of thing you need to figure out during the accommodations process. What does the individual need? Which means, again, as Camille said, it's really important to engage with the individual to find out what do they actually need. Next slide, please. Oh, and I forgot to mention, but we can stay on this slide. The Massachusetts Commission for the Blind is actually the lead agency for all issues related to deaf-blind individuals, not the Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. So when I get something that says anything about deaf-blind, I'm like, nope, not me, them. And I refer over to the deaf-blind unit and the deaf-blind support unit at the Massachusetts Commission for the Blind, who are fantastic. I've had the good fortune of working with them for years. Here's some small stuff that I know of that's quite helpful to some people. On the left, you see a small pocketable device, which is called a telebrailer. And I'm sure Rob could talk more about this than I can, but it's very helpful to take text input and convert it into a refreshing Braille display. I have seen this actually being used with card output, with card caption output, for the benefit of deaf-blind individuals who predominantly use Braille. And the old TTY still has a place with a large visual display and with a Braille keyboard for people to be able to type back and forth in Braille and also see on a large visual display what the other person is typing if they have some eyesight left. So these are just two pieces of technology that I used. Next slide, please. Now let's move on to hard of hearing. We all know a little bit about what that means. It means a postlingual onset of hearing loss, and that depends on what level the person has. Some people may not require a hearing aid. Other people will not function without a hearing aid. There's a vast continuum of hearing loss there. And again, it's really important to engage with the individual to find out where are they at and what do they need, because almost no two hard of hearing people are alike. Next slide, please. So most people, when they lose their hearing, what actually happens is the nerves in the ear die, which is why the most common complaint is not, I can't hear, but I don't understand. It is a little bit like listening to a language that you don't understand. You can hear it, but you have absolutely no idea what the person is saying. And that's really important, and it kind of goes back to why speaking louder does not necessarily help. You have to enunciate, you have to speak clearly, you have to tell the person this is what we are talking about, so they can kind of conceptually narrow down the area of communication and the words that are likely to appear so that they can fill the gaps quicker mentally, because they are going to be missing things. It's really important you have good communication, no background noise, good lighting, no visual interventions or interruptions. If you have a speech disability, it may be difficult for somebody to speech read you or hear you. And of course, you cannot take that personally, because I, for example, have great difficulty with people who have speech disabilities because their speech movements do not match what I am hearing auditorily, which may not match what I'm used to hearing anyway. So it's a challenge for me to understand people with speech disabilities, more so than it is for hearing people in the same environment. So there's a lot of things that can make things difficult, and hearing aids are tools. They do not magically restore hearing, ever. Really important to recognize that fact. Next slide, please. So some pictures of hearing aids and a cutaway diagram of a cochlear implant. Beyond saying that these devices are not something that fixes hearing, there's also something really important. And I don't think I put this in the presentation, it's more of a philosophical thing, is that it is not your role to tell me that I ought to improve myself. I've actually seen people do that. I've seen people in a professional environment say, hey, when's the last time you had your hearing checked? Or, hey, shouldn't you get a better hearing aid? And to me, it's mind-blowing that somebody in a public position would say something like that to a person with an individual with a disability. I mean, when's the last time you've gone up to somebody and say, hey, that power wheelchair doesn't look very good, you should get a better one? People don't do that, but they feel free to put the onus on us as people with hearing loss to kind of improve ourselves. And most of us can't. I, for example, have improved myself as much as I'm ever going to be improved. I got hearing aids for most of my life. I got cochlear implants. Those were personal choices that I made, which has nothing to do with reasonable accommodation whatsoever. Those are personal choices I made. You are not responsible to provide me with a hearing aid or with a cochlear implant. but you are responsible to provide me with ancillary services that help me as an individual who already has hearing aids and cochlear implants. I hope that clarifies it a little bit for you. Next slide, please. So a lot of communication variables come into play. And again, please talk to the person. I cannot overemphasize that enough. Having said that, I'm going to throw you a loop. I'm going to say some people have absolutely no idea what works for them. Okay? And this is because you don't generally walk into Home Depot and see all these specialized, or Lowe's for that matter, or Target for that matter. You don't see rows of assistive technology for deaf and hard of hearing people, or for that matter, for people with other disabilities, which means we are generally not necessarily aware of what's out there unless if you're somebody like me whose job it is to know that stuff. I know what's available out there. I know there's Bluetooth is available. I know that radio frequency is available. I know that infrared is available. The average hard of hearing person who is losing their hearing, who is in a panic, who is mourning their hearing loss, who is trying desperately to connect, isn't necessarily going to know all this stuff. And if you think that hearing healthcare professionals always share all of that information, I'm sorry to tell you, but they often don't. I've seen people come out of an audiologist's office knowing a little bit more, but not necessarily all of that. So they will just know what they know. They won't necessarily know everything. So when you ask somebody, what should this person have? Ask that from somebody of whom you know that they have the answers. Don't ask somebody who just acquired a hearing loss yesterday. They're not going to know anything about it. Really important. But again, a moderate hearing loss, severe hearing loss, and profound hearing loss, completely different things require completely different accommodations. For example, a listening device would not ever work on somebody with my degree of hearing loss. So if you're going to give me a little dinky amplifier with a battery-operated remote control, that's not going to work for me. I mean, I need a cochlear implant, which means I am deaf. I am completely and totally deaf. I would not function without a cochlear implant. Even on the other hand, you give somebody who's got a very mild hearing loss a powerful amplifier and insist on cranking it up, that's going to hurt their ears and damage their hearing. So it's all a matter of talking to the individual and figuring out what they need. Next slide, please. Something important, this is going to impact you. When you provide assistive listening devices, many assistive listening devices, for example, the audio induction loop, the FM system, all this other stuff, require that somebody either have a telecoil or Bluetooth built into their hearing aid. And it becomes a little bit problematic, and in some cases almost impossible. And this is where you call me, and I will help you to figure out what you should be doing. But if, for example, somebody shows up and wants to use an assistive listening device that uses headphones, and they've got a behind-the-ear hearing aid that does not have Bluetooth, then we have a problem. Telecoil. Then we have a problem. Why? Because if you take headphones and you put them over a hearing aid, you're going to get screeching feedback. I'm sure most of you have heard that at some point or another. And it means that the audio is being amplified in a continuous loop. So you have to find different solutions for that kind of scenario. Even on the other hand, somebody has a telecoil in their hearing aid, you don't offer them headphones in the first place. You offer them an audio induction loop, which goes around the neck, which interfaces with the telecoil in the hearing aid to provide the audio without any kind of feedback. And this is the kind of stuff where it gets very nitty-gritty. I could speak for 5 hours on that alone. So if you run into these kind of things, please contact me, but be aware, when you buy an assistive listening system, you're not just buying the system, you also have to buy every conceivable accessory for it. You have to be prepared for headphones, you have to be prepared for neck loops, you have to be prepared for earphones and earbuds, because you need to have the appropriate attachment to work with what the person has or does not have. Next slide, please. You have to post the availability of something. People are not going to ask or even respond to the availability of something unless they know it's actually there. And that's kind of a no-brainer, but I'm always surprised by how many people forget. They spend tens of thousands of dollars and then they say nobody uses it. Maybe because nobody knows it's there. So make sure you always have signage. Next slide, please. These are just some 3 little examples of personal assistive listening devices What these are, they're very cheap devices for the most part. They cost between $140 and $220. They're great for one-on-one communication, like if you go to somebody's home who is hard of hearing and you know the person doesn't have a hearing aid, getting one of these things and giving it to your social worker or your senior care worker is a really great idea. You can put the headphones onto the person and then you can allow them to control the volume and you can speak at a normal pace. This will, however, not work over distance, and it will not work for somebody with a severe to profound hearing loss. But these are really great, quick devices that you can provide. Next slide, please. Now we're going to talk about the hearing loop. The hearing loop is probably the most popular device. However, it is something that you need to consider almost always during the construction phase. It is, as I believe both Camille and Rob mentioned, much cheaper to put something in advance than it is to retrofit something. Every time we're talking about retrofitting, it becomes hideously more expensive. And a loop only is useful in certain situations, and this is where I don't always support what the mainstream thinking of loops is, that they're always helpful. Sometimes they are not. A loop will do nothing in a crowded lunchroom where you're trying to understand the person next to you. It will be completely and totally useless. And yes, I have seen people recommend loops for that. So you have to know what you're doing. A loop, basically, if I can go to the next schematic, please. What the loop is, and hopefully you can see this. If not, I will describe this. It is a loop. It's called a loop because it encircles the perimeter of a room and it's connected to an amplifier which is connected to the sound system. So if I'm standing at the podium and I am speaking, the sound should be coming through speakers for people who need that, but it's also being fed into the loop, which is creating an electromagnetic field around the looped area. And anybody who's got a hearing aid or a cochlear implant who walks into that area and knows that there is such a loop system in use and can manually switch, because some of them are automatic, but most are still manual, can manually switch their device to Bluetooth reception, telecoil reception, is going to hear the signal from that loop loud and clear, regardless of where they sit in the room. So it is a huge benefit, but again, it is an expensive thing to do. Even in the installation phase, it is still a relatively expensive thing to do, and it's not something that you can move around easily. You can tape down portable loops. You can do that, but then you have to watch out about trip and fall hazards and stuff like that. And it's not very elegant, and it doesn't look very good. So if you are going to have a budget for a meeting room, consider putting a loop in to begin with so that you have the loop there. And on the right, you see something else, which is a counter loop, which is a much smaller device that you can put on a tabletop, which has the same exact result. We used that at the mass vaccination centers during the COVID outbreak when we realized that there was nothing being done for people with hearing loss, because this has a microphone in the back that allowed people to understand masked healthcare professionals, and it would pick up their voice and beam it out to somebody with a hearing aid or a telecoil, so they would hear what's coming from the provider without hearing anything in the background. If you have more questions about this, again, please contact me. Next slide, please. An FM system does the same thing. All systems do the same thing, basically. They intend to bring the voice from the speaker or speakers closer to the ears of the listeners for better sound comprehension and for tuning up background noise. And an FM system works the same way. It works by basically picking up the speaker's voice through a transmitter and sending it to a microphone and a transmitter and sending it to body-worn receivers worn by the individual. I will tell you one thing. Many people do not like these systems because it forces you to come up and ask for a receiver, and many people don't want to be put in that position where they have to ask for something. Next slide, please. Infrared listening system. These are high security devices. This is something I recently recommended to a legal situation because this cannot be intercepted. Radio frequency can be intercepted. A loop has spillover, so it can technically still be intercepted by somebody who's outside of the immediate area. Infrared uses beams of infrared light, so it's contained in the area. So if you have a high security proceedings frequently that you want to eliminate any possibility from somebody listening in, an infrared listening system is the way to go. Next slide, please. And for people who are using the telephone, you can get free amplified phones and free caption phones through the Massachusetts Equipment Distribution Program. Now, that's important to note that is for individual use only. So this is something you want to share with somebody who you think could benefit from an amplified phone or from a caption phone, or for the matter, from any other phone for an individual with a disability, because that program addresses everybody who's got a disability. But this is something you can also purchase yourself if you're a municipal entity and you have, say, an individual who works for you who is hard of hearing or late deafened. You might need to provide them with an amplified or captioned telephone, and that is readily available. Next slide, please. Finally, the last category is late deafened, and that's pretty much me. I'm somebody who has gotten so deaf that hearing aids will no longer help me. At that point, I had a choice: either continue life without being able to hear anything or risk the tiny little bit of hearing I still had left by undergoing an operation for a cochlear implant, which did not have a guaranteed positive outcome, but fortunately for me, was a great outcome for me. But not everybody who is late deafened will choose to have that kind of surgery, and you cannot, of course, make somebody have surgery. When somebody's late deafened, they're going to almost exclusively require captioning in order to understand what's being said to them. They will very often be able to speak back to you, but they will not be able to hear, even with hearing aids, what you are saying to them. Next slide, please. So again, a cochlear implant is a wonderful medical device that replicates the function of the ear, of the nerves in the ear that usually die with late onset hearing loss. But again, they do not necessarily always work 100%. I know some people who've had cochlear implants that have not taken, they have not worked well, and others such as myself have worked excellent, but not to the extent that I hoped. I still struggle with the telephone, for example. So everybody functions differently and has a different outcome from cochlear implants. I just wanted you to know that they are tools, they are not solutions, and they have nothing to do with you from a reasonable accommodation perspective. Next slide, please. What you need to provide is what you receive today is CART services, CART captioning services, communication access real time. These are trained stenographers who are incredibly efficient in what they do. And full disclosure, my wife is also a captioner. So I have seen this service firsthand. It's amazing. It allows somebody who has access to the audio to provide perfect captioning, much better, much more accurate than automatic captioning can possibly be over any kind of a distance. And it's very easy to provide on-site or remotely. For example, one use I have often seen is to have a captioner in the auditorium for a town meeting and then to project the output onto a large screen or monitor. So anybody in the room, they don't have to come forward and identify themselves. As long as they can read, they can be in the room and they can read what is being said by everybody in the audience. This is really something that more communities should do. Not enough people are providing that, as a matter of course. Next slide, please. Automatic speech recognition is something, I don't think this is working very well. I think it's freezing, but the idea being basically that I am able to talk and somebody is going to be able to read what is being said. And again, you can use this when it is something that you need to provide on the spot, and that's the only thing we have. It is certainly something that you can offer the individual. There is no laws against providing it, but if you have a critical meeting or a large public meeting, you do have to provide card captioning and not automatic speech recognition. And I apologize for this not working. Next slide, please.
Automatic speech recognition can be a very useful
Oh, now it's working. Strange.
no other form of
I think we can skip that. Let's go to the next slide so we have time for some questions and answers too. Finally, we're seeing an explosion in technology. Bluetooth, for example, Bluetooth and Wi-Fi based systems are starting to supplant loop-based and FM systems. However, we are kind of an intermediary phase. as somebody who provides reasonable accommodation to members of the public, you need to think about yourself too. Can you imagine the nightmare you're going to be in when, instead of handing out standardized devices that you've tested beforehand, you now have to deal with 20 or 30 different people's smartphones, which may or may not be charged, which may be running different operating systems, which people may not know how to operate. This gives me conniptions. I would much rather, at this point, still rely on fixed devices that I, as the provider of communication access, have total control over, as opposed to systems where I am reliant on whether the person knows what they're bringing with them and knows how to use it. So that is something that I would caution you about. We're still in this transitionary phase. It doesn't mean you can't be forward thinking and think about Bluetooth and think about Wi-Fi. It just means there are some considerations. People say, oh, this is the next wave. It may be the next wave, but who knows if it's actually going to work very well. Next slide. Environmental access is important, which means alerting devices and technology that make people aware of what's going on around them, like fire alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, doorbells, are important, not just in a public building, but also for individuals who work at home. So that's something that you have to think about. People who live at home. I, for example, when I take these off at night, I cannot hear what's going on around me. So I am potentially vulnerable to carbon monoxide. And recently, it was in the news that two very prominent deaf people died. What did they do? They took their car, they drove it into the attached garage because they couldn't hear the engine. They didn't realize they had left the car running. They died from the carbon monoxide making its way into the house. And it was a good opportunity for us to remind everybody. I mean, good opportunity meaning in terms of warning. Of course, it was a tragedy. But it allowed us to reach out again and say, people, you have to get accessible alarms, which is something that shakes the bed when you can't hear it, something that flashes the light or shakes the bed instead of something that's purely audible. And you may not be responsible for that in terms of what somebody does at home, but you should be aware of it. So I think the next slide may have some pictures of some different technologies. But I think I think we're at the point where we want to give time for some questions and answers. So I'm just going to say these are some visual fire alarms with bed shakers. Next slide. These are some universal systems that make you aware of everything that's going on, not just the doorbell, not just the alarm clock, but also the fire alarm, carbon monoxide detector, etc. Next slide again. And these here is a third system which actually can make you aware of somebody. For example, here's the last thing I'm going to say, and then the rest of this, I think we're going to skip the next slides. But I want to say something. Often when you have two people living together, they might both have a hearing loss. And one thing we're seeing a lot recently is somebody having Alzheimer's and a caregiver living with them with hearing loss. And I've gotten calls from people that says, help. How do I know that my partner with Alzheimer's isn't walking out the door without my being able to hear them? Very easy solution. You can do one of two things. You can either put a detector. So if somebody opens the door and breaks the contact, it will send a signal to the person's bed and shake the bed and wake them up to let them know, oh, somebody opened the door. Or you can get a pressure sensitive mat that when somebody steps onto it, it alerts the other person through a shaking bed and a flashing light, and you can take that kind of a pressure-sensitive mat and put it right outside of somebody's bed or any other area that needs to be monitored so somebody knows that somebody's there. And having said that, I'm going to quit now with a slide and a thank you for advancing them, and we're going to give some time for questions and answers.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was a ton of really great information. I know I learned a lot. I'm going to jump right into the questions. First question. I'm getting ready to upgrade ALDs, assistive listening devices, in the building. Should I consider Bluetooth technology?
Absolutely, you should consider it. What I would do is I would ask, do you know who the audience is? It would not be a bad idea to do a survey of your local community and find out what do most people use. Because if most people do not have hearing aids with Bluetooth technology or they do, or you are not considering getting receivers with Bluetooth technology, the question would be, who would this be for? Because not everybody who comes with a hearing aid or cochlear implant has Bluetooth. I have Bluetooth natively in my cochlear implant. Anybody who got the processor before me does not have Bluetooth in their cochlear implants. So it's kind of a question of, do you know your audience?
Thank you, Jonathan. Just a reminder, people, you can submit your questions in the chat, or you can also raise your hand, and we'll call on you to turn on your video and microphone. And if you'd like to ask a question privately, you can submit it just directly to me. Select my name in the chat, and I will not say your name. I'll read it out loud, your question. Thanks, Bill. I know folks also have a lot of questions and are interested in learning more about digital accessibility. Rob touched on that a little bit today. We have a lot of resources on digital accessibility. The links are in the slides, and I'll share those in the follow-up email also. But you will get a survey also when you sign out of this. If that's something you're interested in learning more about, there's an opportunity on the survey to let us know that. Next question. Are towns required to have all virtual meetings for boards and commissions?
I guess that one's for me. I guess this is something we can talk about in more detail offline as well. Off the top of my head, I would say I don't know that you're necessarily required to for every meeting, but certainly it might be something that you have specific members of your community who are trying to access certain meetings, and that might be a way to accommodate that. And if you have the technology to do so, it certainly is another one of those universal design principles that would allow more people to have access to the meeting. But yeah, feel free to reach out to me and we can look into that a little bit further and talk about maybe what needs you're trying to meet or what kind of requests you're getting.
Thanks, Camille. I don't know if you want to mention anything about the open meeting law extension.
Sure. Just if anyone hasn't seen the COVID-19 allowances under the open meeting law have been extended again. So those were set to expire at the end of this March, and those have been extended to June. Off the top of my head, I believe it's 2027. But there are some other bills working their way through the legislature as well that might potentially make those changes more permanent. But that does mean that open meeting law allows you to have hybrid and virtual participation. So if you have questions about how that works or, what members have to be in public and things like that, we're happy to kind of point you in the right direction. There's also an open meeting law kind of division of the Attorney General's office that can answer questions about that as well. Jonathan, thank you.
Jonathan.
Yes, I forgot one important thing that I wanted to mention, and thank you, Camille, for triggering it somehow. You triggered it in me, so thank you for that. I forgot something important. Hearing ear dogs. I forgot all about that. I wanted to mention that because that is important, because I've been hearing from municipal police. They are quite frequently involved in situations where they are called to establishments where somebody who is deaf or hard of hearing is brought what they call a hearing ear dog, which is a service animal that's covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act that is allowed to go everywhere the owner is allowed to go. That is really important. You are not necessarily in a position of asking, can I see documentation? what you have to do is you have to use your judgment. If this is a dog where you can see that somebody's straining to hold the dog, and the dog is like trying to go after somebody with spittle flying and stuff like that, that's not a trained service animal, okay? That is clearly an out of control pet that's being passed off as a service animal. But if it's a well-behaved animal and it seems to be under the control of its owner and it seems to be fulfilling a task that the owner says that it does, then you should let that be and accept the word of the individual that this is, in fact, a service animal. Can only be one of two things. It can either be a dog or it can be a miniature horse. It cannot be anything else. People get confused about the distinction between service animals and therapy animals, which are completely different things. Therapy animals are not covered by any law. You are free to allow or disallow service animals, but when it comes, therapy animals, but you are not free to not allow somebody to bring their service animal with them if they say this is a service animal. And most people have not heard of hearing ear dogs, which are trained to alert their owners to the presence of sound. And I'm saying this because, again, I've heard from a lot of police officers that this is something that almost all of them have had to deal with, which actually came as a surprise to me. I didn't know it was that prevalent. So thank you again, and sorry for butting in.
No, that sounds great. Yeah, so the Mass Office on Disability, we provide a lot of information on service animals. So just to add a little bit of extra context to what Jonathan said, you are taking people at their word. You're allowed to ask just the two questions. The first one is this a service animal required due to a disability? That's a yes or no question. If they say yes, you can move to the second question, which is what work or task has the dog been trained to perform? And the individual needs to describe a disability-related task. So in general, you wouldn't be asking a lot of follow-up questions, but you can ask for clarification if they say something that's very vague. There are also instances, certainly, of emotional support animals and people not realizing that those are different than service animals. So sometimes people are trying to pass them off as service animals. Sometimes they are genuinely confused and they think that they're allowed to go everywhere as well. So those animals essentially provide emotional support for individuals with disabilities, but they're not specifically trained to perform a task. So the other thing I wanted to comment on that Jonathan pointed out is the behavior of service animals. You are allowed to deny or ask service animals to be removed if they are out of control, just like you would be able to ask any individual to leave if they were out of control, right? So I guess just remembering the principle that, people are treated equally. And so there are these kind of like behavioral requirements as well. So I don't want to take up too much of the question time on service animals, but we do have a lot of, we have a web page, we have a lot of like video recordings on service animals. We're happy to answer questions about them. I see that there's one question in the chat. Do all service animals wear a vest that shows that they're a service animal? The answer is no. They are not required to wear a vest, and anyone can purchase a vest. So that's not really an indication that it necessarily is a service animal. But some people choose to buy the vest to kind of signal to the public that this dog is working and that they shouldn't try to interact with the dog and distract it from its task. So you might see that. I think that's all on the service animal questions. I was just double checking the chat.
Yeah, and we are at 12, but I'm going to ask this one last question because I think a few people might have it. I'm the chairperson of our city's Commission on Disability, and we are buying the CART system, which will mostly be used for town council meeting. My question is, how do we know if a deaf or hard of hearing person is in the audience? It will cost money to use the system, so we'd rather not use it if no one is present. Are there any legal restrictions?
I can answer that pretty easily. If you go back to what I said at the beginning about the percentage of individuals with hearing loss in your community, you're going to find out pretty quick that you will have individuals with some form of hearing loss in the community. You're not going to be able to purchase card service. These people are not for sale. You can't buy my wife, and my wife is a captioner. But what you can do is you can plan an accessibility budget. You can plan, and you should do that. That's something we haven't even talked about. Every community should plan an accessibility budget. It takes into account the worst case scenario, meaning, let's say somebody comes and they want CART and ASL interpreters for every meeting. How much money do you possibly need in the year? And you set that aside. If you don't use it, great. What I would do in your particular case is I would offer CART first. Now, ASL, simply based on the demographics, usually you can see people who are deaf, okay? And I'm saying usually. A deaf person will usually let you know they need an ASL interpreter. It's pretty rare for a deaf person to show up and expect ASL to be there when it hasn't been announced that there will be ASL there. But it's very common for hard of hearing people to show up to things that they may not know that they won't be able to understand. So I would offer CART first, and then I would maybe afterward ask the audience and say, how many of you found this was helpful? I often go into a room full of hearing people, what I assume are hearing people, because I'm not going to check everybody's ears to see if they have hearing aids. I walk into a room full of hearing people, and then halfway through, I'm kind of glancing around, and everybody's looking at the CART screen. So I would say that CART is probably very effective for general audiences. If you tend to attract people who are like, I would say, north of 50 or 60, because simply the incidence of hearing loss is so high at that point that 30 or even 50% of the population of that category will have some form of a hearing loss. I hope that helps you.
Yeah, I was just going to tack on to the end. As we said earlier in the presentation, you can certainly like incorporate CART as often as possible as like a universal design kind of principle to make it the most accessible for everyone. But if you do have limitations or like, you're talking about every single meeting that happens in a town or something like that, you can certainly set up those make it clear in the advertisements and the registration page that you can request ASL and CART in advance and provide a deadline by which those have to be requested so that people know that those are available, so they know that they might want to come, and they know what they have to do to make sure that those are in place. And then on your end, again, you want to book those, as far in advance as possible so that you have them. And then if you don't get any requests, you can potentially cancel the reservation. But again, if you're like recording the meeting, something like that, like it's really helpful to have those services on there just to make sure that everyone can access the materials later on.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. That's a wrap for us. Please fill out the survey that will pop up when you sign out. And thank you again to Jonathan. We really appreciate your time. Thanks.